Hello all, here's a shortened video to explain spine stability and thoughts on resilient and competent movement. The story starts 30 years ago.
As a young professor, I was measuring the spine motions and loads in elite powerlifters. We were using video fluoroscopy, which is a real-time moving x-ray, while lifters were lifting competitive loads. This had never been done before. We calibrated the range of each spinal joint from full flexion through to full extension. Well, as some of you may know, we filmed an injury, and this was the first time it had ever been reported in the medical literature. It's easier to see in this cartoon. This is the curvature of the spine with the lifter standing upright. As he bends forward through the hips, he flexed the spine slightly, which you see here, and then lifting the load about 10 centimeters off the ground, he dropped it and said, "Oh, I've hurt my back," which was an awful thing to happen. However, we went back and looked at the fluoroscopy records, and just at the L2 and L3 joint, just at that joint, that angle, it went to full flexion and past its calibrated angle of 1/2 a degree. The rest of the spine did not move. This was a buckling event creating a micro movement. So for the first time, 30 years ago, we saw that an unstable event or a buckling event could cause a back injury. And as we will see later, instability and micro movements causing pain at a joint are also the consequence of the result of injury. Well, now for some more foundational thoughts. When a muscle activates, it creates force. This is well known, but it also creates stiffness. Now, force creates movement, but the body uses stiffness to control movement. When we stand upright, for example, we're using primarily muscle stiffness to maintain the upright posture rather than absolute force. But the curious thing is that as a muscle activates from 0 to 100%, the force in the muscle increases. Now, it's not exactly linear, but it's pretty close. But stiffness is an asymptotic function that levels off somewhere below 50% of muscle activation. Well, this interaction is interesting because when the force and stiffness is low, the joint has the potential to experience unstable behavior, but not so much in the mid-range, but also at very high levels of activation and load, where a force can actually overpower the controlling stiffness and allow a micro movement and an incident of insufficient stiffness. Well, I'd like to show a video now with 3 foundational issues with stability. And the first one is the spine is the whole body actually is an articulated linkage, and the spine must create proximal stiffness to allow all distal athleticism. The second aspect is the spine is a flexible rod, which allows us to dance and move. However, it has to be stiffened with a muscular guy wire system to bear load. And thirdly, as we will see and have seen, the body needs to organize a certain amount of stiffness to engineer out the micro movements that can lead to injury. And now for the
Welcome to BackFit Pro HQ, and we're going to discuss why spine stability or core stability is absolutely essential and non-negotiable to enhance performance and injury resilience. And I will introduce 3 essential principles. The first one is that the spine is a flexible rod. It allows us to move and dance by being mobile. But if you take a mobile rod, a flexible rod, and ask it to bear load, it collapses. So the spine is this strange structure where it has to be stiffened to allow it to bear load and be stable. The more load applied, the more stability is required. And if I take away the stiffness and stability, you see the spine collapses very quickly. Well, what creates the stiffness and stability, of course, are all of the abdominal muscles, the ones that form the wall, quadratus lumborum, the extensors, and the fascia complex all around the spine. So every muscle is absolutely essential. But there's more to the story now, because the discs adapt to being very mobile, and they become mobile and flexible. But those don't allow very high load bearing before they start to delaminate, because they follow the laws of fabric science. They are not a ball and socket joint like the hip joints, for example, but layers of collagen fibers in a composite material like a fabric. So if you're going to adapt them to bear high loads, you will have to back off on the mobility and stretching aspect to avoid injury through overload. So you have to choose which way you're going to train and adapt it if you want maximum performance and injury resilience. And the evidence of this is seen in dancers, as we've measured in Middle Eastern belly dancers, for example, who have incredible mobility and motor control, moving their spine in very interesting ways, but not one of them had the strength to do a sit-up. And if they developed a lot of strength, we would see more stress on the collagen fibers in a delaminating manner. Conversely, the power lifters have very stiff collagen and the matrix between them holding all the collagen fibers together, but the price they pay is a loss of mobility to allow them to bear extremely high loads. Well, the next non-negotiable principle for why spine stability is absolutely essential is the concept of proximal stability to unleash distal mobility in this linkage of our body. So for example, if I was going to push a person using my pec major muscle, my bench press muscle crossing my shoulder joint, when that muscle activates and shortens distally to the ball and socket joint, it flexes my arm to create the push. But on the proximal side, it bends my rib cage towards the joint. So if all I use is that bench press muscle to flex my arm, my whole body collapses as well. So it's not a very effective performance. However, if I lock down and stiffen the proximal side of the joint with core stability, then 100% of that muscle is now unleashing its power production to the distal side to create a very effective push. And exactly the same thing happens at the hips, for example. The muscles that cross the hip connect to the pelvis. If I flexed the femur around, the spine would also bend at the same time, which would allow the power production developed in the hip to be leaked across proximally. But if we stiffen the core, 100% of the power is directed to moving the limb. So to run fast, cut hard, kick hard, etc. requires proximal stiffness and stability. The third element has to do with micro movements at a joint. And when a spinal joint becomes damaged, it loses its inherent stiffness and therefore its stability. So when I move this spine, I probe it and push it in flexion and extension, and I twist it, you will see which joint lacks stability. It's this one right here. And as you see, there's very large movement taking place at that one joint. Now the brain, sensing instability at a joint like that, shuts down the neural drive. It won't allow your brain to send out full strength neural drive to the muscles. It holds it back a little bit. It's like having a limp in your leg and you can't put full power to the leg, inhibiting performance. But it also inhibits injury resilience, because you'll see the motion now taking place and focusing on the facet joints, for example, of the lax joint. However, core stiffness and stability stiffens the whole spine and then allows the hips to move and produce the power across the hips rather than in the spine, making up for the loss of stability through damage. And over time, that joint will gristle up and regain its stiffness and stability. These notions are captured in our textbooks, but that summarizes 3 elements of core stability that makes it non-negotiable for everyone.
Well, we weren't the first to recognize that the muscles act as a guy wire system to allow the spine or a mass to bear load. In fact, Leonardo da Vinci in the 1500s used the analogy of the muscles on the spine acting as guy wires on the ship mast. We then tested this theory to see what the role of individual muscles were. We had people load weight into these buckets up to 40 kilos per bucket, and we measured with electromyography which muscles activated and the level. And what was so interesting, and I might add that we guided in needle electrodes into the deep muscles of the spine, the psoas, quadratus, 3 layers of the abdominal wall, etc. But interestingly, in this particular experiment, the muscle that the brain activated the most with each increment in load was quadratus lumborum, which, as you will see in many different tasks, is quite often a very prime stabilizer of the back. It certainly is not a muscle like transverse abdominis. When you measure the role of the muscles to allow the spine to bear a load in a normal person with undamaged joints and normal disc height, the abdominal co-contraction was only 4 to 5% of maximum, even to hold 40 kilos in each hand, or a total of 80 extra kilos. But if they had a flattened disc or a disc bulge, sometimes a co-contraction up to 10% was required, but not much more. And certainly in other tasks where people are lifting maximal weight, we see the requirement for muscle co-contraction going up to about 100% activation. In this slide, I'm just showing 3 different exercises called spine stabilization exercises, and we're measuring the role of each muscle contributing to stability. And you will see that in every exercise, different muscles play a different role. So the trick to spine stability is to get the muscular response appropriate and tuned for that particular task. So in summary, the muscles and their activation level must be tuned to achieve sufficient stiffness, which is just enough but not too much, because too much stiffness creates a load penalty to the spine and a different problem. Well, for some reason, MRIs have become linked with pain, and it's a bit of an issue because MRIs are collected while the person lays on a table, which is very stabilizing. But if they stood up, we would start to see some of the micro movements taking place, and which are linked directly to pain. So there is unstable joint behavior very grossly and very graphically. Our next study looked at measuring the micro movements and their link to pain. So first of all, we had to develop the system for watching video fluoroscopy renditions. So let's look at a recent injury, an instability, and a little bit of lost disc height. And what we'll see, if I just go on to pointer options and arrows, there we are, and we'll make it visible. I will run the tape, and you're going to see an instability occurring just right there. And that's where the pain occurred in that cycle of movement in that particular person.
next
So we can
example,
directly
where this is an
link
old
now instability,
but
to
what we
direct
see are
tissue
spurs
irritation
around the
and,
joint.
This is not
new,
nor is this joint
or
unstable any
catch.
longer.
Well,
it has since stabilized, it has gristled, but watch, the pain is now coming and the unstable behavior is occurring at the joint above, which now bears all of the movement responsibility. You'll see right about there the trap occur, and we can correlate that with pain and confirm that yes, that unstable behavior is linked to pain. Well, when we measure unstable behavior and the link to pain in the clinic, we'll start with the work of Stan Gertzbein, who is a surgeon, and he would measure through sequential static X-ray shots the center of rotation of every joint. And a healthy joint with stable behavior has the center of rotation somewhere inside the disc. And yet, when a disc becomes unstable, we get shearing behavior, and we see the center of rotation leaving the disc in these various patterns, all of which are associated with pain. So now let's measure a live person externally. Our instrumentation is measuring muscle activation and the three-dimensional motion of the spine, and we ask them to simply move forward. As the spine is flexing, you'll see a little instability catch right there. Not at the end range of flexion, but halfway through. In fact, this occurred at 30 degrees. Well, when we take the derivative of that, or the instantaneous slope, and plot it as a function of flexion angle, we see there is the instability occurring every time as they move forward through 30 degrees and experience that shot of pain. Well, what's interesting is that we were able to show the person a stiffening muscle controlling pattern, and immediately the movement catch disappeared and the person was pain-free. This is after them seeing many different clinicians and their mechanism of pain going unrecognized. Now let's have the person move to the side. So we see they laterally bend, a very pure motion, but the instability occurring in the flexion axis, or the clunk right there. And when we plot that, you'll see there once again is the classic instability. And once again, we only worked with that person for 5 minutes, showing them an appropriate muscle controlling and stiffening strategy. A pattern where one day the pain is on their right side, the next day or a few hours later, or they move, the pain then shifts to their left foot and their big toe goes numb. That is much more characteristic of unstable behavior leading to pain. Then throughout the session, we're watching them move. Do they use spine hygiene? I might ask them to pick up their backpack, for example, and I'm really observing when they bend over, are they using the same controlling pattern as when they lift the weight? In other words, they might get hurt lowering objects but not raising them. But these are the things that we're noticing when we're really paying attention to that patient when we're going through the assessment. And then we go into the clinic and we create their pain with provocative testing. We perform intentionally provocative and destabilizing maneuvers to see if we can create their pain. And then immediately we tune their muscle stiffness to see if the pain goes away. If it goes away immediately, we will stay with our assessment that spine instability and joint instability is leading to their pain. So we then have been following my clinical textbook, Low Back Disorders, which is quite a heavy read, and it's only meant for clinicians. I did write a book called Back Mechanic, written for the lay public. But we use the guidelines in there then to coach the person out of pain, teaching them how to stabilize and how to move and accomplish the tasks of daily life. Then we move on to the formal triggering of their symptoms through instability tests. So the first one might be, for example, a prone instability test, where the person relaxes on a testing table. This is a very poor setup because the spine has been broken into flexion, and that might be the pain trigger rather than instability. But we then probe each spinous process about a kilo or slightly less with a rattling technique that we teach in our courses. And we might find one segment that is particularly sensitive than all the others. By the way, we tested this with our colleagues at University of Pittsburgh Hospital System, and we found those with a positive sign here are most likely to do well with very specific stabilization exercises. Then we ask the client who is experiencing pain to squeeze the glutes and raise the legs, and we adjust the amount of muscle bracing, the level of the leg raise, etc., seeing if the pain diminishes, or in an ideal sense it may even completely disappear. But there be a first test. But that's a sagittal plane instability. Let's look at a lateral shear instability, for example. And if so, for example, having them stand upright and performing a Pallof press would increase their pain from the instability, and it would be a very contraindicated test. And how we would find that would be the lateral shearing test, where we pull gently on the iliac crest and forward on the shoulder, holding it down, creating a lateral shear across the spine. If we create pain, we then ask them to brace the abdominal wall to different levels and repeat. And if the pain disappears or goes away, once again, we've proven that a stiffening, appropriately tuned strategy takes their pain away. Well, the next question is, does strategic stiffening enhance performance? We tested this in several different studies. We would measure passive stiffness of the spine and an active stiffness as well through quick release experiments. And then we would allow the subjects in the study to do various stabilizing moves. So these are 10-second isometric holds of things like bird dogs and side planks and front planks. And we would measure a residual stiffness that would last for about 20 minutes and increase their pain control, for example. Then the question was, would a 6-week training program give them any resilience? Interestingly enough, not only did it increase their pain resilience, but it also increased their performance. In this particular study, we looked at a group of Muay Thai fighters, and following that proximal stabilization program, it increased the speed of their distal athleticism, being the speed of a hand strike and the force delivered by the foot or the fist during a kick. We've also measured in world-class lifters, for example, that training a big three style of stabilization exercise gives them more proximal stiffness to unleash more distal athleticism. It was so interesting to watch the World's Strongest Man competition this year, where the competitors squatted, I believe it was 750 pounds over and over and over again, and they would fail somewhere around 12 to about 15 repetitions. Look at the YouTube clip at the repetition before the failure, and you will see the instability occurring in their core. Their hips shift a little bit. And what happens there is the brain then shuts down the neural drive. If it detects instability, it won't send full neural drive to the muscles. The antidote to that would be unilateral carries, for example. Here's a strong woman and a strong man doing various types of training to address that failure or loss of proximal stiffness in these strength maneuvers. Well, we then published a study in Spine proving that when you can tune the um, amount of stability to the individual, it takes their pain away immediately. And I'm just showing here four case studies. And why only four? Well, it takes days and days to measure and quantify stability, measuring the muscle response, etc. But this was proof that you can get immediate pain relief from unstable joints. So what is a stabilization exercise? Well, a stabilization exercise is anything where you can guarantee sufficient stability, but at least you're doing it in a spine-conserving manner. You're creating reasonable muscle activation levels, and you do the programming on an endurance training regimen rather than a strength training regimen. This is to allow the people to be able to repeat the patterns and not get tired, because so many fall into unstable behavior only when they get fatigued. We then measured over the last 30 years different exercises to challenge the back muscles, the front muscles, the side muscles of the torso to find out what is superior as a stabilization exercise. And when we compare things like the Roman chair extension and the Superman, it was the bird dog that kept surfacing, bubbling up to the top as the superior exercise for achieving sufficient stability. So when we look at a sample program, I can't give you what a good stabilization program would be in a generic sense, because every single individual gets a different program tuned to their injury history, their current fitness, their goals, their pain sensitivity, etc. But I'm going to start by asking this question. There are three lateral torque challenges or exercises, but are they the same? And the answer is no, they're not. This is a 3-point bend, and there's no shear load through the spine. It's very difficult to create an instability in the spine. And yet some people think, well, the next exercise in the progression would be a standing Pallof press. But I'm just proving that that actually induces shear in the spine, would very much trigger an unstable behavior. Instead of graduating or progressing from a side plank to a Pallof, they'd be much wiser to go from a side plank over to a unilateral carry to avoid the triggering shear load. So the next element would be to deal with neurogenic facilitation and inhibition. We were one of the first to quantify that hip pain, as it relates to back pain, causes, not in everybody, but in some people, a neurogenic facilitation of the psoas muscle and a neurogenic inhibition of the gluteal muscle. So there might be an example. If we detected that residual change in a person's neurology, we might adopt a very specific psoas kind of a stretch to unleash the hips because of their hip pain and their back pain. Then we have to create proximal stiffness with what are known as the big three, the curl up, the bird dog, and the side bridge. Notice that these are performed every day, not 3 times a week as some trials have tried. So the curl up is just a hover of the head and shoulders off the ground. It is not a full curl up as we're seeing here. Here is a very strong athlete who has tremendous muscle bulk in the shoulders. It's very difficult for him to put his hands under his low back and support the back for back resilience because of the shoulder stress. This would give him shoulder pain. So instead, we take the hands out, place them on the rib cage, and support the low back with a folded towel. So there would be an adaptation to enhance the tolerance and the effectiveness of that particular exercise. When doing the bird dog, we want appropriate stiffness, controlling stiffness proximally, and not allow too much movement, which reduces the amount of stiffness. And then we might adapt the exercise. Say someone had hip replacement or knee replacement and they couldn't get down to the floor. We would then do a standing variation of the bird dog, but we wouldn't allow poor form to take place and cause unnecessary stress on the back. Excuse me. The side bridge, let's say a person has damaged their rotator cuff of their shoulder and they can't do a formal side bridge. We might start them off with just a double leg hover, which isn't as good because it doesn't activate latissimus dorsi, which is so important. But we might have to start there. And then we look at the side bridge from the elbow and knees, for example, graduate to the elbows and feet, and then to pick up the neuromuscular compartments, we would then have the person roll forward and roll back through the ball and socket joints, the shoulder and the hip, to challenge the various neuromuscular compartments of the abdominal wall. Then a walking program is non-negotiable. We then look at the, we might have the person stand and just do knee circles, liberating the knee and the hip without much torso movement, and then convert their pained posture to a pain-free posture and a stress-free posture with a very stacked spine, swinging the arms about the shoulders, and we've proven this many times. This is a therapeutic exercise that relieves pain, but walking left with this posture continues to be an exercise that induces pain. Well, we then go into various progressions of pushes and pulls and lifts and loads and carries using TRX straps, which once again is a 3-point bend. There's no shear load or ability to create unstable behavior with a pull performed in that manner. So to summarize, we would then find the pain the pain-free position, the position of respite, and coach the person. They have always a safe place to go. We show them how they can move without triggering their particular pain triggers. We then show them how to create proximal stability for them, then appropriate mobility. In this example, it's an example of a drill for thoracic extension to de-stress the low back, and then move them into building a foundation for pain-free movement with various carries and lifts and lowers and squats and etc. Now the person is out of pain, they've been truly clinically stabilized, and they're ready to performance train. And I've summarized the science of that in my textbooks, Ultimate Back Fitness and Performance and Gift of Injury. And we have all kinds of examples from many, many Olympic sports and many professional sports where we've taken people who have highly unstable backs. In fact, they had no athleticism left at all, back to the world championship. We've done that enough times to prove its effectiveness. So in summary, injury and pain can result from a loss of stiffness, and loss of stiffness can cause pain. But when you can assess the specific mechanism and confirm the effective intervention, you can remove their pain very, very quickly. I summarize these thoughts in my clinical textbook, Low Back Disorders, and my book written for the lay public, Back Mechanic, which is now written in Spanish, Mecánico de la Espalda. These are available through BackFit Pro and our various distributors through South America.